It's only the second week.
This is our first time meeting this year.
Oh,
Okay.
Okay, so good morning. It is Tuesday, March 15th. This is meeting of Senate Natural Resources and Energy. This morning, we're introducing 5 new bills, and we're starting with H411, an act relating to the retrieval and use of covered animals. And would you welcome the chair of House Natural Resource, Fish and Wildlife, Representative Sheldon. Good morning. Thanks for coming in.
yeah. Good morning. Thanks for having me, Representative Sheldon, for the record. I guess, what's important to know about this bill is it essentially codifies what the vast majority of Vermonters already practice, which is they go out and when they're hunting, they intend to retrieve and use an animal that they're pursuing. The need for the bill was actually kind of came from game wardens finding that there were between 60 and 90 instances of what they felt were wanton waste occurring about every year, and they didn't really have an appropriate way to address it through statute. So this enables the enforcement essentially of folks who willfully, purposely, the words in here are recklessly and intentionally pursue and kill an animal and do not intend to use it. And as you likely are aware, it is the result of a number of years of working things out among stakeholders, and it does represent, on some level, a compromise. The coyotes are covered in that if you illegally take a coyote, you are required to properly retrieve and properly dispose of it, but they are not covered under the use section. And we took testimony from the Fish and Wildlife Department. They felt that requiring them to be used year-round would be creating a season on them, and that they preferred to pursue that separately. So that's where we are. 29 other states, excuse me, have laws against the wasting of legally taken animals. So we are right in there with those folks now. And the other important thing to know about the bill is that it only applies to covered wild animals, and those are essentially animals with hunting seasons on them. And there's a really nice list that Michael Grady put together, but big game, game quadruped, game birds, and fur-bearing animals.
So if there's an animal that doesn't have a season on it, like coyotes, since it's just open, is that?
You know what? I see them as having an open season. So for me, that's a season, and that's the difference of opinion that's among some of us. But that's what I was saying before, is that we were advised that there's a perception that that's not a season, and that if a season is going to be applied to them, it should be done through a different process besides this bill. So we have taken them out of the need to be used. They are required to be used under the trapping. So they're treated differently, and the trappers supported that. So that's where we are.
Thanks, Representative Sheldon, for being here. So when you said 60 to 90 cases a year generally, is that what you're saying? Is it mostly deer? I'm just curious, or what is? Are they able to say what they're?
You'd have to ask them.
Okay.
I don't know the answer, but it certainly includes deer.
Includes deer, yeah.
And it includes things that very much conventionally are expected to be used.
Okay.
I mean,
yeah,
people generally go hunting deer because they really want them, and there are instances where they are, not utilized.
Did you all talk about the investigative process during these kinds of things? For example, you come across a deer in the woods, that's dead, it's been left there. Is it usually hard work to actually do that sort of investigation in terms of, tracking it back to who left it?
Oh, I'm sure it is.
That's what I suspect. But
these are,
did that get talked about it all in committee?
We weren't into that place this session.
Because that's largely, correct me if I'm wrong, that's largely what we're talking about, right? People that are leaving things and then disappearing.
I'm not sure that's the case. The example of the deer that we've heard is hanging on the porch and never being used.
Okay, that's
So
helpful.
that was a little
That's
more
helpful.
straightforward.
Yeah, that's helpful. Okay, yeah, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
How about animals like skunks? You know, like someone might say, okay,
Yeah.
this is a nuisance. They're a nuisance. You know, how do you deal with? Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. How do you deal with skunks?
Right, so there are a number of exceptions in bill, and one of them is protection of property. And I would expect, and this actually just came up with an inquiry that I received recently. So skunks are covered under the bill because there is trapping seasons on them. They are a fur bearer.
Yeah.
And they can also be a nuisance. So, I mean, I think when you're thinking about what we were advised is that best practices today are if you're gonna kill an animal in protection of property, you really should reach out to the Fish and Wildlife Department before you do it. And obviously, game wardens have discretion in how they're going to be enforcing this, and there's a lot of common sense around if a skunk, which, I mean, I have had a skunk decimate my garden, so I understand that skunks can definitely be a nuisance in terms of your private property, in addition to being quite stinky. But yeah, so there's exceptions in this for reasonable protection.
Senator Campion?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So what about animals that are hit by cars? Was that part of a conversation at all?
I think they'd would be covered under the exception, and that, so they're not knowingly, intentionally taken.
Got it.
They might be recklessly taken, but
Yeah.
they're not knowingly and intentionally and recklessly taken.
Okay.
So no, they would not be covered by that.
All rise. Do you mind if we stay seated or do you want to stand up?
The latter would be good, but this is okay. I've heard that there's a suggestion, we may be receiving a suggestion for another edit to the bill. So I don't know how you, and I know that in speaking with you weeks ago, there was sort of a delicate balance going on. So can you say a little bit about where that balance point is so that we're aware of what you are trying to bring forward and where someone's trying to push it one way versus the other? Like, what do we have to hear in terms of
What do we what?
what do we have to hear? Like what?
I don't know the amendment that you may be asked to take up, but I would say this is a very well vetted and nuanced bill that, of course, I'm coming from the House, my own perspective on it, but we feel like we've worked hard to strike a balance on this. We did not have a lot of opposition to it on the floor, and we've worked really hard to have both an effective bill and a reasonable one. So
What was your floor vote?
actually, it didn't do a roll call.
Okay.
Wait,
It's great.
Yeah.
For 2 years.
Great. Well, it's we were working in the same area on March 13th, 2020. So
Still haven't found that deer.
no, yeah,
hopefully we've brought it to you and you can use it.
yeah, we recognize that. Well, thanks. Any committee questions?
No, this is really helpful. Really
Sure,
appreciate
Sheldon?
it. No, it's great.
Yep, thanks for having us in.
Congrats on it.
When you said,
No, please, I was just, you did my usual congrats and thanks for coming. Go ahead.
when you say there were 60 to 90 reported, there must be many that just simply weren't reported.
I think that's probably
There
accurate.
was,
Yeah,
game wardens didn't see them, or
right.
someone
Didn't see
kind of
it.
looked and said, oh, that's too bad.
The woods are lovely, dark indeed.
Yeah. The anniversary of that poem, 100 years ago this June,
All right.
written in Shaftesbury, Vermont. Isn't that interesting? Come on down. Written in June, which is interesting.
Yeah.
You're welcome. You can share that with anybody you want
Of
to.
course, usually snow in June.
Could be good for a floor report.
Right.
One last quick question. So on the nuisance side, I know that that's always, crows, where do crows fit into this landscape in the bill? Are they covered? They're not
Yeah,
covered?
they are covered.
Okay,
And that was supported by the Fish and Wildlife Department, and they can still be taken in protection of property. So farmers who are feeling like they're getting robbed by crows can protect their property. But, you know, we also took testimony that crow populations, like many others, are way down. And so we thought it was important to cover crows, so they're in there.
okay. Just wanted to double check, read, I go. Perfect, thanks. Anything further?
Thanks.
All right.
No, that's
Thanks.
great.
Good
Thank
luck
you
on
so
the
much.
floor.
You know where we are.
Yeah.
If you
Yeah.
need anything.
What are
Thank you.
what are you doing on the floor?
Page 606, community resiliency and biodiversity protection.
Wow, great. That's today.
Today.
Great.
We have
And my mercury bill, 501?
Mercury bill, 500.
500.
Great.
500.
All right.
All right,
Thanks
great.
again.
Great. Thanks so much. Good to see you.
4 and 500, not a Mercury.
That's right.
All right.
Those are Montego.
I don't know where.
Well, we'll hear from the sponsors
Wonderful
and
to
we'll
see
do
you.
the walkthroughs.
I like your heart.
One of my grandchildren's grandmother, and I'm my own grandpa, is that
Yeah.
what song goes?
Yeah.
Made these.
They're beautiful.
Yeah.
Really beautiful.
Yeah.
And I did know that, although I couldn't hear what happened 100 years ago today, but many 100 years ago today, at 2 Bruce Day, it's tomorrow.
Ah, it's March. Yes. Well, I was saying in June, this coming June is the 100th anniversary of Frost's poem. It was it Walking in the Snowy Woods. Yeah.
It's in the
Stop
public
it.
domain.
Thank you.
Does that,
Written in June, Shaftesbury, Vermont.
Yeah. My little horns must think it queer. All right.
Yes, we all know that one.
Yes, you have to recite it.
Yeah.
That's great. So, good morning, Representative McCullough.
Good morning.
We're here to learn more about H-175, an act relating to the beverage container redemption system. Thank you.
Alrighty. As mentioned, I am Representative Jim McCullough from the brave little hamlet of Williston. And I am delighted to be in this room again. Thank you, gentlemen, and you. So, opinion, this is an environmental bill that adds money and jobs. Why do we need to make changes? It hasn't been significantly changed since it was introduced in 72. The only real changes we're adding Department of Liquor and Lottery to the bottle bill and some minor changes in handling fees. And I'll add at this moment, this bill adds the 500 or the 50 milliliter shorts, which were not included at that time. So those ubiquitous little drinking and driving tools that we see all over the highway will at least cost them an extra 15 cents if they throw them out. The nickel deposit that was done in 72 would equal like 27 cents in today's money. Our return rate in Vermont is only 75%, but we can look to increasing that to 89 or 86% if it's restored to a dime, because our Ways and Means knocked our bill down to a nickel. Many of the beverages that this bill holds weren't even conceived, if not or marketed in 72, and 54% of our beverage containers are not covered at the current rate.
Sorry, did you say 54?
Yeah,
What was the percentage when it originally passed? They were not covered.
I don't know that.
They didn't have any of
Well,
the
they,
sports drinks, and things like that. Or
right,
iced teas. Right.
yeah. So, and it is interesting that our plastic bottles are the second largest item litter. Largely water bottles. And 25% of the beverage containers today that if they go through the MRF, get broken and end up in the landfill. So they aren't able to be upcycled if they've gone through the redemption system, and B, they're crowding our landfills. No, did I say landfills? One landfill. So that's 25%. That's glass. That's even just the glass.
So can you, I just want to make sure I get that statistic right. So 25% of the material entering a MRF ends up broken or something, and then ends up in a landfill because
So it's 25% of it. Actually, that was just glass that gets broken and ends up in the landfill. A lot of the plastic gets contaminated in the process and can't be upcycled, meaning used in as good or a better way than its current form is, versus downcycling, which is crushed and put into a road for base or making other materials that are less useful and valuable than the container. So the handling fee for commingled containers goes from 4 cents to 5 cents. And that's to encourage the collection of commingled, make it easier for craft bottlers, manufacturers in Vermont to compete. It essentially includes all beverage containers, with exception of dairy products, of course, and non-alcoholic cider. And interesting and non-dairy substitutes such as oat beverage and almond beverage, which we used to call milk, but not anymore.
and if I may, why are those out? Are the containers hard to clean, or I always thought that was the thing with dairy, that it's hard to not have a contaminated dairy container.
Right. So why is dairy out? They get exemptions for just about everything, as you're aware. And the Ways and Means Committee felt that if that's the case for dairy, I guess, why not
For oat milk?
substitute oat milk, almond milk, and so on. But also, yes, their containers are largely a difficult container to recycle or deal with.
The multi-layer?
Yes, yeah, as well as boxed wines. And so the bill does ask the agency to figure out these kinds of problems as far as containers. So, yeah. So it's going to just make a lot more recyclable products actually be usable again for what they originally were doing. I mentioned upcycling versus dead end or downcycling. If we think if we throw it in the blue bin, it's going to get recycled, but there's music and then there's music.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, maybe it gets recycled, but not in the best way.
If I may,
Yes.
also, from what I've heard, I mean, so little is actually recycled. Even, we always think we're going to recycle our ways. Colleagues said, stop thinking we'll recycle our ways out of these problems.
Right.
Recycling isn't, I mean, we need to do it without a doubt. We need to do as much as we can, but you're right. Everybody thinks everything that goes in that blue bin, and really not that much actually gets recycled. And then a lot also just gets tossed, as you know, and ends up in other spots.
This is one of the reasons my bill had a dime instead of a nickel. It's
Yeah.
called a sheet.
Yeah.
And that benefits the Clean Water Fund.
I'm confused. I thought that the original bill had 27 cents deposit and the Ways and Means knocked it down to 22 cents.
No, the 27 cents is its nickel value in 2021.
So we undervalued it. We should have just done the half penny back when we originally did the bill, or what?
No, the original, so the 27 cents is only information about the original nickel would equal 27 cents today if it had kept pace with inflation. The original bill was a dime as it went out of our house for recycling, out of our committee. And Ways and Means put it down to a nickel for.
You guys agreed?
I didn't, but oh well. I mean, we don't argue with Ways and Means very much, and I pleaded for keeping it there, but I wasn't successful. And they, through some convoluted, I believe, reasoning, felt that if it was a dime, there'd be more people returning the bottles, and that would deplete the Clean Water Fund. Like, wait a minute. We want to encourage recycling and upcycling of clean products. And yes, Clean Water Fund is important, but it's the co-benefit of the bill. And you know what? I think, in my opinion, Vermonters have to pay a dime instead of a nickel. They're still going to they're still not going to return them to the store. And
But the 27 cents, you could send 7 cents to the Clean Water Fund and
yeah,
have 20 left over.
yeah, and with the thought that that's still a nickel, only in today's funds.
Representative McCullough, what do our neighbors do in terms of New York and New Hampshire, Massachusetts? What are their return numbers, do you know? Are they a dime?
I don't, but I do know that Maine is a dime,
Yeah.
and they have 89% return rate.
Wow.
And
Wow.
at a dime, and they include all the similar kind
Yeah,
of containers, beverage containers.
There was
Wow.
we had a similar discussion, you'll probably remember, around the plastic bag bill. And there was a provision in there to say you could buy a paper bag if you didn't have your reusable bag with you. And the study I remember best was that in other states, the jurisdictions that did this, if you charged a nickel, something like 60% of the people would just pay the nickel and take a paper bag. That wasn't the whole point. Was we didn't want to drive paper bag use. We wanted to promote reusable bags.
Yeah.
When the nickel became a dime, the rate at which people just paid for the paper bag dropped from 60% to 10%. So
I was not aware of that.
there's some sensitivity around a nickel versus dime.
Yeah, yeah, and we did good work on that bill. We meaning our two committees. Thank you. So, there was a question it's a perennial question, usually around, well, always around money. In the Connecticut River Valley is, you know, what's this gonna do? It's gonna be havoc, it's gonna be mayhem and fraud. And
We hear
fraud,
that a lot also on the New York side. People are concerned that fraud's gonna happen.
yeah, so, I mean, and we got testimony about that, and interestingly enough, one of the ardent supporters of this bill has a facility redemption, yeah, thank you. I could use a little of that. A redemption facility in the Connecticut River Valley, all for it. But I queried the department about how many cases of fraud, documented fraud, that came to them, and what the total dollar value was. And it was too big goose eggs. They had no documented cases whatsoever. It's urban legend. And has it happened? I'm sure, but not to a level that rose to the agency's, I guess I would say, knowledge.
Yeah. They had some cases of palletized bottles coming in from New Hampshire to Brattleboro.
Yeah.
And it was like obvious fraud.
Yeah.
And the department spoke with their New Hampshire colleagues, and the pallets of bottles stopped arriving. I think that's the only real story I've heard that the department participated in. Maybe there are others.
Yeah, and it's interesting, they didn't even document it. So I think that's really, I'd heard of that case also, but I didn't have the department wound into the story as you do. So what other problems might we find with this bill beyond fraud that we heard about? And one of them was labeling wine. Many of our wines were actually made and bottled long before there was a labeling requirement. So this bill provides for a sticker. So I think that's probably.
Can you say something about the sticker? So is that put on where?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you, on the stickers,
I don't know.
there was a criticism of
Before they buy it.
main program
Yeah.
that when they added wine, they had to hire 5 people in their distribution system that just opened bottles, cartons of wine and applied stickers. So that they thought it was a very expensive way to getting that mark on the bottle to market, redeemable. Did you have any testimony around who's doing it, how and what it costs?
No. Well, my sense is, so Michael, this question revolves around who puts the stickers on wine bottles, and where, and I guess my sense is the distributor does that, but I don't know.
Right, so the main issue was that it was being regulated kind of at the state level, and underneath 175, A&R approves the distributor or the manufacturer to attach the sticker for purposes of compliance. So it doesn't fall on the state's responsibilities, the distributor's responsibility. In the past, there's been testimony that most likely what will happen is the manufacturer delivers the bottles with a sheet of stickers to the retailer, and the retailer attaches.
And did you have I know that there are we used to see stickers on every Vermont bottle of spirits, but I don't know if some are now. I know I looked at a bottle of wine the other day and it had, you know, like the Vermont, well, not Vermont, Oregon 10-cent or something like that in the label itself. I don't know if that's also happening on spirits. Do you have testimony about how many creators of bottles are now just saying, okay, just like the soda people did, now we're gonna start to just build it into a label?
Certainly the hope is that it'll be built in to the actual manufacturer. But again, thinking of spirits in the same thought as wines, you know, some of my favorite single malts are 20-some years old, and didn't have anything like that. I think the Department of Liquor Control put those stickers on. And by the way, I didn't mention, but the Department of Liquor Lottery testified in favor of this bill. They're totally in favor of having the 50 milliliter bottles included. And I was like, whoa, really? And then I realized afterwards that they get to keep their sheets. Which might be something an enterprising committee might be thinking about, but at any rate.
Representative, liquor and lottery, that's part of the administration, right? I mean, the administration came down and they basically their support. They don't have any kind of independence on their own out there.
I think that's correct.
Well, they do have a board.
They have a board. Okay.
Right, so the board could probably vote, but they are appointed, the head is appointed by the governor.
Okay, thank you.
But there was one other thought, who else is against this? One of the concerns was about internet sales. And our statutes require purveyors via the internet to do the deposit. And it's, I believe, the Agency of Natural Resources that is charged with overseeing that. And so are some sneaking through? Of course, but that's the way it's supposed to.
Okay. So if you sell it in the state from out of state via the internet, you'll need to collect the nickel or dime a bottle, whatever, container.
Yeah.
And then deposit it into the same sort of account that regular in-state distributors do.
That's my understanding. Yep.
And then I suppose the only way they would ever get some of that money back would be through their share of sales calculated like a comrade, sorry, when they're co-mingled, they have to figure out what percentage of sales do you have, and I think they allocate the money based on what percentage of sales you had.
Allocate what? money?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm across, forget it.
So the deposit is paid.
Yeah.
The person that paid that deposit has the right to collect that deposit through return of the nickel. The manufacturer distributor is supposed to have an account that is set up in which to reimburse those consumers. If they don't, if there's more money in their account than what should be reimbursed, they remit that to the state according to the requirements of the
Representative McCall, how about redemption centers? So I know that some of them are, you know, they are village stores, mom and pop operations, whatever, and there's been pressure in some past years to eliminate, relieve them of the obligation to accept empties back. So did you take testimony around what would likely happen? And, I've heard concerns expressed that there are some small shops now that say, we have to take in all this other stuff some of which they didn't even sell, that they may just get out of the redemption business altogether, so.
Yes. Thank you. I should have mentioned when I was talking about pushback, we got some pushback from mom and pop stores, one from a house member who owns a mom and pop store. And interestingly enough, several years ago, prior to this bill, obviously, my village store opted out of taking returnables, which you can do under the agency's rules if there is a major retailer or redemption center within 5 miles, Michael?
That was changed a few years ago. Now it's an alternate redemption location that serves the public need.
And so mom and pop stores were doing that for several years, at least several years before this bill. And that is an out for them today with this bill. I'll add, in the same way that our solid waste bill of 2014 ultimately, because of its timing, ended up creating compost businesses in the state of Vermont, including collection, curbside collection of food residuals. We believe through the testimony that we've got that this bill will grow recycling or redemption centers as businesses. Because
Is that the main experience?
don't know that, sorry. It might, I will only conjecture that since they get 86 to 89% return rate, I bet that did happen there. Yeah, ours is at 75 with what we've got.
Did you look into that? I mean, besides the nickel for the deposit, there's that second nickel, right? That is built into the price. It covers the cost of all the handling of the bill. Did you look into adjusting that so that in essence, the people managing those bottles
Yes.
have an opportunity to make
Thank you.
a penny or a fraction of a penny more, and it would make it a more attractive business to be in?
Yes, and the bill raises that fee requirement from the distributor to 4 cents
Yes.
and 5 cents, depending.
I think you raised it to 4 cents for commingled.
Yeah,
We did not change it for the
okay.
non-commingled in order to further incent commingling. So you raised it to 5 cents for commingled and left it at 3.5 for non.
Okay. Okay.
So I think a year or so ago, Kathy Jameson we had a miscellaneous bill that I think ran into the COVID parking lot. And that went 3.5 to 4. So now it's 3.5 to 5. So we're creating a larger differential to make commingling even more attractive.
Yes. Yeah. And
Or
help cover their costs.
non-commingled pays 5. You
No,
No.
commingled pays 5.
oh, sorry.
And non-commingled pays 3.5. Because it's there to incent commingling. Because otherwise the system of non-commingled, it requires the retailer and the redemption center to sort out all of them separately so that they get redeemed separately from the commingled. Whereas with commingled, everything goes into the same bins.
Cheaper to handle.
Right. It's cheaper to handle, less labor, less time,
Right.
less sorting.
So, sorry, I'm realizing I'm a little fuzzy on this because I was thinking of it the other way around. But it's cheaper to handle than wise. Who's handling the nickel at that point? I'm trying to think of why is non-commingled 5 at that point, you think?
So the nickel is not the nickel that
Right.
was put on the, right?
Yeah,
The nickel that is the manufacturer. The manufacturer pays a handling fee
yeah.
to any redemption location per container.
Right.
And that is separate from the 5-cent deposit, which the redemption center pays and gets reimbursed from the manufacturer for. So that's basically a zero sum
Right.
for the redemption center. That's why they get the handling fee to handle their costs, pay for their costs of redemption.
Okay.
And
So
the-
I think I just heard it backwards. Sorry if I get this straight. That I had thought you said the co-mingled bottles got a nickel for a handling fee, and the non-commingled did 3.5.
Underneath 175, correct?
Why would, if you wanted to incent someone to commingle, I would think you would make that the more attractive.
So, Mike, could you tell us, Mike, when we, Mr. O'Grady, when we first did this years and years ago, there was a nickel deposit plus a handling fee. What was the fee then, and how many times has that handling fee been increased to where it is today?
That Senator Bray is correct. It was backwards. It's 5 cents if you are not part of the co-mingling program, and 3.5 if you are part of it.
Save money as the distributor by joining a commingled pool. Got it, thanks.
Senator Bray,
The
that's correct.
distributors lobbied to have a commingling pool, did they not?
The distributors did, yes.
Because it saved them money and was less cumbersome for the
Right.
producers and the distributors.
Right, and they all don't have to individually operate their own collection. and
Yeah,
redemption.
They put that out to bid and they wash their hands of it, and they're just in the business of,
I wouldn't say they wash their hands of it, they have to pay for the program.
but they don't have to employ people to do it. They've hired it, contracted it out to
Right,
others to do.
right.
Yeah, and it's no longer their responsibility. Is that correct?
Right, it's just like any extended producer responsibility program, the stewardship
Yep.
organization is the one that assumes the responsibilities for each individual manufacturer.
And-
That's basically the tolerance.
And the handling fee originally was how much? 2 cents, 3 cents?
Originally, it's been increased a couple of times. I'd have to go back to see what the original handling fee is. I can do that, but it's been increased since I've been here, I think twice. So I will have to do some research on that.
So while you're doing the research, we might ask ourselves if it made sense to increase the handling fee, because times have changed and expenses are different and incentives to handle these things required additional funds. Why wouldn't we be changing the initial 5-cent deposit for the same reasons? That's questions for ourselves.
I think that's a policy.
Right, it's for ourselves, not for you. So, but you could help us by giving us a history on the handling fees, which have been driven by the industry that recognizes the industry's costs and recognizes inflation and recognizes what they believe to be necessary changes. And we might take all of that rationale into account when we review the deposit fee.
Thank you, Senator McDowell. Senator King?
Mr. Chair, I would say, given the complexity of this, I do think the committee might benefit from
Yeah.
what are we doing now and what are we trying to do
Yeah,
with this?
so-
I just think, I mean, wanton waste is,
We're a little out of sequence because we had a guest in the room,
well, of course.
so, but we'll do it.
That would be
All we're
helpful.
doing today
Yeah.
is Mr. O'Grady's gonna walk us through the bills and do a walkthrough on each, and then the the lead sponsor is coming in to just give us the street
Yeah, so we
experience.
will have this is what happens right now
Yes.
in Vermont.
Yeah,
And this is how
Yeah.
this would change it.
Yeah.
I think that would help everybody, including those watching out there, that there might be some
yes.
misunderstanding.
A little bit.
Which also escapes,
First,
how did we get here to where we are?
Right,
okay,
yeah.
so,
And
yeah.
that's not a criticism on your presentation, which,
Not at all.
not at all. It's,
Totally.
it's, yeah, no, you've helped us to understand the complexities of it for sure.
Good.
Okay,
Is there a way to get on the Seinfeld episodes to see the various histories? Did they have,
Is there, one?
Seinfeld did, I think, 2 half-hour shows on
yeah, no,
how to beat the bottle deposit on their comedy.
Well, I can't figure out the history because you don't have the book here that I need.
Yeah.
for volume.
I think there should be.
McCormick probably has that at home.
Volume 1, yeah, it's not there.
I thought I saw the other day,
So there's volume 2. Volume 1's not there. They all can walk away.
we've been out of here 2 years, so who knows what happened. Okay, so anything else you want to bring our attention to before we?
well, I think not on this bill, but is it your intent to hear about, 501, the food residuals bill?
Yes, so let's jump in on that one as well, please, so.
Alrighty, 2012, we enacted Act 148 that prohibits the disposal of food residuals in landfills and required recycling and reuse of those. And since that time, businesses and farms around the state and the agency have been looking for ways to better manage food residuals. And one of these ways just emerged as food deep packaging equipment found its way into the agency Natural Resources Permitting Department. And you, as David Dean would say, corporate you, your committee heard a lot about that. And about like, what? No sideboards? No metrics for running this place? And so this bill can to get that problem solved, to protect ultimately the soils, because even after biomass electrical generation, the solids still stay in the compost, but and get land applied. So
Can I ask you a very high level question? I don't have the 2 versions in front of me. How far away from 282 did this evolve?
282.
S282 was the food residual rejection, microplastics in soil.
I don't know the answer to that.
It's not that far.
Okay,
And so the intent of the depackager is to separate the food, but it is a giant machine that has some success in separating the food from the packaging, but it is very successful at mangling everything and microplastics, broken glass, ending up in the product that comes out of there. And the US EPA have studied this material, and it almost always contains a level of contamination of plastic, glass, and other material in which the food was packaged. And of course, you remember from your testimony on the permit issue that the triage that's supposed to happen is unusable food first should be used, unusable food. in all possibilities for humans and then for animals, and then the triage goes all the way down to landfilling. And it turns out that this machine largely obviates the need for that, doesn't obviate the need for it, skips a lot of those steps, and it goes pretty much directly to biomass generation and then compost for the detritus from that, into composting and land application.
And when you refer to triage, are you talking about that hierarchy that was in the solid waste?
Yes.
Okay, for
Yeah.
food residuals.
Yeah. We don't have standards right now for monitoring this contamination. And my original bill set some standards based on experiences in one or two, well, in Europe actually, and I think maybe, but we found that right at this moment, the state isn't prepared to analyze at that level. So this bill does have a pretty significant study section that requires them to look at this, and it's combined with a ban on further construction of depackaging facilities, with the exception of when we only have one in the state, and with the exception that if they need to do some work to make their end product better, they can get a permit to do that, but not to increase their capacity. So a partial permitting is still in play there. This study wants to also understand what foods are really acceptable for depackaging. Is there any real reason that hot dog rolls just have to go through the machine? For instance, aren't they easy enough to separate it to what would be the source, which I guess would be the supermarket, and other foods. And our testimony indicated from the single manager, the owner of the facility, that when they got just one type of material, it was way easier to deal with. And by the way, for ease, we're all talking about Casella, and Casella supported the bill with that caveat that I put in an exemption for improving the place for a permit. And he supported the bill with that caveat in there. And of course, that facility can continue to operate. And it is important to note that the study is set for January 15th, 23. And that may need some tinkering now, and I'm not sure, but there is a pretty substantial list in the report that we stipulated. A list of the food depackaging facilities, yeah, that's that one in the Brave Little Hamlet. Summary of the chain of custody of the materials processed there, where they come from and where did they come from before that. The sites or facilities of final disposition of the depackaged materials. A summary of how the materials are produced for equipment that's used, including standards for the management of the materials. The study asks, we want to know the amount of microplastics, glass, and other contaminants in the food depackaging material. And whether or not they've got detectable levels of PFAS. And I think we all understand that a lot of the food packaging that we purchase has PFAS in the liners of the boxes, on the liners of the cans. And so this is a very important thing to try to learn. There was some concern about the composting part of this. And so the bill asks for the Agency of Agriculture and ANR to work together to coordinate and cooperate on adoption of standards, working together through an MOU. The agency is now going to have to, by request of this section, evaluate the practicability of implementing the food residuals hierarchy set forth in 10 VSA 605 in a more stringent manner. And it asks what other jurisdictions are doing. There's going to be rulemaking in section 3 that is going to be advised by section 2 report, and ANR is not to implement the rules prior to legislature. Wait a minute. ANR shall not adopt the rules under this that restrain agricultural activities without the Agency of Agriculture, and we did talk about they needed to work together. And ANR shall not initiate the rulemaking until your committee and my committee has heard about it or seen their proposed rules. And I've always wondered about that. Fine, good, there's the rules. Goodbye. I don't know what that really amounts to, but I guess that's policy again. And then the moratorium will be lifted once the rules are in effect. It's my opinion, with the prevalence of plastics in our universe and actually in our soils, and that all continue to degrade and become microplastics. And we have, as we sit around the table here, microplastic in our bloodstream. And that's because of the food we eat that absorb them, and because of the animals who ate the food, so there hasn't been a lot of science around that, but it's a lot like, it looks like a skunk and walks like a skunk, it smells like a skunk. Well, it is. And so I think this ultimately ends up as being a very important bill. It also could be a shot across the bow to the agency, which is important. I understand they have a permitting department, and many of us think they should have a regulating department instead of a permitting. Their major goal is to get permits out the door, and that's my opinion. And in this case, there seemed to be a real need to get this permit out the door, because it did get out the door without any cycle. And that's probably what I hear speak. Thank you.
Any questions for Representative McCall? Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim.
You are entirely welcome. And I built this bill over the summer in result of your good questioning that you did on this very topic now a year ago, maybe. 2 years ago, I'm not sure. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Great to see you.
Good
timing.
Thank you.
So, Mr. O'Grady, thank you for joining us. I think we'd like to set the Wayback Machine and go right back to 411 and do bill walkthroughs on the 3 bills we've heard about from sponsors.
Before I do, I did determine the answer to Senator McDonald's question. The original deposit was 2 cents or 20% of the initial handling fee was 2 cents or 20% of the deposit that the consumer paid. So if it was for most beverage containers, it's going to be 2 cents, but for liquor, it would have been 3.
This is when the original handling.
Original, that's the original handling fee. But then in 2005, it was just changed to 3 for all. And then regardless of mingled or commingled. And then in 2007, it was changed to 3.5 for commingled and 4 for non-commingled.
That was 07.
07.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that is helpful because my local redemption center guy said, well, we've never increased the nickel has always been a nickel. I said, I don't know the history of that, but it's sort of begged the question of had we kept pace with increase, because he was pointing out how he can't hire anyone at less than $15 an hour to show up and sort out.
What's the significance of that statement?
His costs have gone up, and the fee that he earns per bottle has not changed much has not changed at all for the last 15 years.
I mean, add that when Coca-Cola sold 6-packs of Coca-Cola, and they were a nickel in the soda machines in the 50s. When you returned the bottle, you got 2 cents back, which is 40% of the cost of the bottled soda. And now the bottled soda is it's larger than a 8-ounce bottle, 6.5-ounce bottle. It's Coca-Cola's.
They're like 12 ounces, aren't they?
Pardon?
They're 12 ounces, aren't they?
I think they're 12, and but it's $1.25, isn't it?
Oh yeah, at the cafeteria, definitely.
And in a soda machine, and you get back a nickel if you could find someone to take it back.
Yeah, the pricing of soda is very interesting. A liter or 2-liter bottle would be 99 cents. And then a 16 or 22-ounce bottle will be $1.75.
And the deposit is
I think
a nickel. And it's sugar and water.
Right. So, Mr. O'Grady, thanks for coming back. If you could please walk us through H411, an act relating to the retrieval and use of covered animals.
Sure. Does everyone have a copy?
We do, yes.
So the bill would establish requirements for the retrieval and use of covered wild animals that are taken/killed through hunting or trapping. So the first thing the bill does is it adds a new subchapter to the Title 10 chapter on the regulation of game. And the new subchapter is for retrieval and use of covered wild animals. The first section, MBSA 4921, is the definition section. And the most important definition in that section is that of a covered wild animal. The definition, I will admit, is not as transparent as you might like because it references other defined terms in 10 VSA Part 4. So a covered wild animal means an animal that is a big game animal, a game quadruped, a game bird, a fur-bearing animal, or a crow. Well, you need to then go look at the definitions for each of those specific terms. Big game means deer, bear, moose, wild turkey, caribou, elk, and Atlantic salmon. Game quadruped is a caribou, elk, moose, deer, gray squirrel, rabbit, and black bear. Game bird is quail, partridge, woodcock, pheasant, plover, Wilson snipe, other shorebirds, rail, coot, gallinule, wild ducks, wild geese, and wild turkey. Fur-bearing animals, beaver, otter, marten, mink, raccoon, fisher, fox, skunk, coyote, bobcat, weasel, possum, lynx, wolf, and muskrat.
There we go.
So then there's a definition of process, and that's basically the slaughtering or butchering of a covered wild animal for its edible meat or useful parts. And this definition of unfit for consumption, those parts of the covered wild animal or the covered wild animal itself is decayed, rotting, diseased, or infected. So then you come to page 1, 10 VSA 4922, the first specific requirement is for the retrieval of a covered wild animal. It's whenever a person shall not intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly kill a covered wild animal and intentionally or knowingly fail to make a reasonable effort to retrieve the covered animal and use the covered wild animal as provided under the subchapter. So that's the first requirement. You have retrieval. If you've intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly killed that animal, it's not an accident. It's not your car hits a deer and the deer goes off into the woods. That is not intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly.
What's recklessly covered?
Recklessly basically requires that the person knows that there's a high risk of physical harm, and basically they deliberately proceed to act or fail to act in a conscious disregard of that risk. So in order to demonstrate reckless conduct, the plaintiff is required to show the defendant exhibited a conscious disregard to a substantial and unjustifiable risk. But when you're acting in a way where you have a conscious disregard to the killing or not of that animal, and you deliberately to proceed in the behavior that you're engaged in, that is reckless.
And what, can you give us a concrete example of someone acting recklessly that resulted in taking? And I can think if you're taking a bad shot, but you're intentionally shooting, so I don't think they're already covered.
It's been a while since this happened. You're not supposed to use machine guns, automatic weaponry, any way, but there was an incident where someone was just firing indiscriminately at a herded deer with an automatic weapon. That would have been reckless.
Okay.
Representative Sheldon mentioned also, if somebody hits an animal, is that reckless? It's not intentional, but it would qualify as.
I don't think the automobile accident is
reckless.
Intentional, knowingly, or reckless. You're not acting with a conscious disregard to running into a deer.
Okay, thank you.
I need to do this, but can we pause at the bottom of page 1 to have Representative Dolan do this because they're presenting a bill on the floor, and then we'll return to Mr. Brady. My apologies to Mr. Brady.
The country.
We're all staying, and you all have a bill on the floor. So thank you for coming down. Can you wait for the page here? You are able to introduce H466, and an act relating to surface water withdrawals and irrigation transfers. So can you introduce the bill to us, please?
Yes, thank you. For the record, Carrie Dolan represents Carrie Dolan from Washington 7th District and the House Natural Resources Fish and Wildlife Committee. And I thank you for this opportunity and thank you for the chance to present this to you at this moment. We have 3 bills on the floor right now, so thank you. The purpose of H466 is to assess water withdrawals and proactively establish a water withdrawal management approach to support our current water needs, having adequate water supply to support existing uses, to achieve and maintain Vermont's water quality standards, and to support aquatic habitat now and into the future. The bill supporting these existing uses, water quality and habitat, is especially necessary as we build our resilience to the impact of climate change, including periodic drought. It addresses a gap in state law regarding surface water withdrawals. The Agency of Natural Resources currently relies on piecemeal regulations centered around riparian law, which is the so-called riparians, those property owners that abut surface waters can use water flowing through their properties reasonably. As a result, Vermont currently does not know where we are withdrawing surface waters, how much water is withdrawn, or assurances that our water quality standards are being met. This bill addresses that gap. It addresses water withdrawals to establish a predictable water withdrawal management program that will support these water uses among all our uses, our businesses, homes, farms, ski areas, and industries, as well as maintaining recreational uses, meeting water quality standards, and safeguarding the ecological health of our rivers and other surface waters. To summarize, the bill adopts a 2-phased approach. The first phase establishes a registration and reporting program for significant water diversions. And the threshold there for the registration is at 5,000 gallons or more of surface water within a 24-hour period, which is a level that was intentional to gather the non-residential water use. Information will be collected for 2 years and to report water withdrawals annually. Exceptions to this registration and reporting include fire suppression or emergency response purposes and uses already that are required under regulation, including reporting, such as snowmaking and drinking water supply. The second phase is to use this information gathered from the registration and reporting to develop by rule a surface water diversion permit program for withdrawals. That means more than a de minimis threshold that will protect surface waters and Vermont's water quality standards. There are exceptions there as well. Those exceptions include the permits are not required for surface water withdrawals for fire suppression or other public emergency response, and existing snowmaking withdrawals, since they are already regulated under existing snowmaking rules. H466 also establishes criteria and a review process for a term called interbasin transfers. This provision allows the Agency of Natural Resources the discretion to review any other surface water withdrawals involving transfers to ensure that we're meeting our water quality standards. For interested parties, I would recommend that the committee hear from members of the task force that we looked into this issue for the past year. That includes the Department of Environmental Conservation's Stream Flow Protection Coordinator, the Trout Unlimited Office of the Connecticut River Valley Chapter, the representative from the Ski Areas Association, the Vermont Natural Resources Council, the Department of Environmental Conservation's General Counsel that worked with our Legislative Council in drafting this bill, the Golf Course Association, Superintendents Association, the agricultural businesses, which were represented by the Murkowski Excavation, and a hydrologist with Fitzgerald Environmental Associates. Other potential witnesses or interested parties would include perhaps the director of the Water Management Division, the director of the Department of Environmental Conservation, the director of the Drinking Water and Groundwater Protection Program, and agricultural interests. such as the University Extension or berry growers, for example, or other vegetable growers that rely on irrigation. You may also be interested in hearing from the state of New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. They've had in place a water monitoring water supply program for quite some time. The purpose of this bill is to demonstrate the success. The outcome would be that we won't see water stressed by withdrawals, especially during drought conditions, which we anticipate to occur more frequently during our growing season. And there will be room for new users who come in and have a need for water.
Senator Campion.
Thanks for being here. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
We can always pull this apart later, but I'm starting to get some calls from farmers concerned about cost and things like that. I don't know if you've heard from farmers, and if you can just say a word or two.
Yes.
If you have to go, that's fine too.
I had heard that anecdotally as well.
Okay.
And some of that is misinformation,
Okay.
not intentional, I'm
Sure,
sure, but
sure.
the fear factor of the unknown, the uncertainty that it inscribes. There's a registration, as I mentioned, phase 1 is registration. Phase 2 is the actual permit program that will be built upon the information gathered regarding the registration. Since there is at some level, you can register through evaluating using estimates, and others at a certain magnitude, your registration will have to be metered. And so there is that concern about whether it would cause and what would be the magnitude of cost. The intent was not to have the onerous cost at all. The intent of our registration is to really understand how much water is in the system being used to ensure that we have water available into the future. The second phase, in terms of the permitting, was will be at that same level of the registration level. That would be designed to ensure that for the larger users of water, we are doing and managing our water wisely with a system that recognizes that. So there is, that's why I think there is an important opportunity to hear specifically from the agricultural community. We had in the House side, we heard from the representative of the agricultural committee, plus we had the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets there. Oh, that would be another agency to hear from.
Great. Thank you.
Great. And I know that back in the beginning of the session, there's a Senate version, and you were pointing out there was a difference, but I'm assuming whatever differences between the two bills, you've already worked on this one, and everything is baked into this one as you would like to see it move, right?
Correct, but I think there's probably some flexibility in terms of looking at what more clearly define what that registration threshold should be, what that threshold should be. We certainly don't want to create any unintended consequences. If we put too much of I think a pressure on the agricultural committee and converting the withdrawals or the water use from a surface water to a groundwater system, that won't be I think helpful, because we don't want to over stress our groundwater supplies either. Well, the real intent is to ensure that we have water available for agriculture and all other uses into the future. And this is why it's really important for us for your committee to think about, if I may offer the question regarding those thresholds, and in particular to ensure that we are in fact supporting agriculture in a wise way, to see that we're all in, we're gathering information to help us understand the water demands today so that we can ensure future water demands in the future.
Thank you very much.
So that would be the thresholds, how to calculate those thresholds. Is that right now it's at 5,000 gallons per 24 hours. Is that over a month period or within a 24-hour day? So some of that clarity I think could be, we would be better served at further diving into those sorts of questions.
Did you have any testimony on the expense related to having a metering system sufficient to measure that kind of those withdrawals on a farm?
We did not.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good luck.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, good to see you.
Good to see you.
My apologies, Mr. Grady.
I'm just watching the debate on their bill on the floor.
What do they have up first?
Mercury lamps. Everybody's asking, will I be able to grow my cannabis? Will I be able to go to the store and buy a 4-foot LED and grow my cannabis?
You know who loves mercury?
Cannabis?
Nitka. I remember I tried to get Nitka on some bill. She said,
We are,
oh, I know, it's all right. I would say it if she were right here. She said, you know, I used to play with balls of mercury. It's like, okay.
Anyway, back to 411. Mike Grady with Dutch Council. You've gone through page 1.
yes, thank you.
On to page 2, there's the new section for use of covered wild animal. A person who retrieves a lawfully taken covered wild animal, or a person to whom the lawfully taken covered wild animal is transferred shall retain the animal in the person's possession until it is processed as food, processed for its fur, hide, or feathers, or used for taxidermy. The inedible or unusable parts or portions of the covered wild animal produced from processing shall be disposed of pursuant to the requirements of this subchapter. That sentence was added because there were interested parties who were construing the first sentence as requiring the entire animal to be used.
Okay,
And there is just not a use for every portion of a processed covered wild animal. So there was a sentence put in to say your inedible, unusable parts are to be disposed of and don't need to be
you
used.
don't have to eat the feathers.
Correct. But then there are 2 exceptions from the use provision. If the use requirements shall not apply when the covered wild animal is unfit for consumption or use. And remember, there's a definition of that. When it's decaying or a part of the animal is decaying or diseased, you don't need to use it. And then part of the negotiation on the bill, the requirements for use do not apply to a coyote taken by lawful means other than trapping, provided that the coyote is retrieved and disposed of pursuant to the requirements of the subchapter. The concern is that outside of the trapping season, coyote don't have much use for their fur, their pelt, or their meat. So they can still be taken because they're still lawfully allowed to be taken under the Fish and Wildlife Board rules for hunting. They don't need to be used, but they do need to be retrieved and disposed of properly. During the trapping season, that's when their fur, their pelt, hide can be used, and it needs to be used during the trapping season.
I mean, they have market value.
It has a value, yes.
Okay. So if you shoot a coyote in winter, when its pelt might be fine.
Well, that's during the trapping season.
Oh, I see.
Actually, you're right. It says to take in by lawful means other than trapping.
Yeah.
So you could shoot it during the winter and not have to use it.
What are examples of unlawful taking of coyote?
Taking a coyote with the use of light, taking a coyote with a machine gun, taking a coyote with they're called air rifles. They shoot a dart. Yeah, basically.
Poisoning.
Bait, yes. Actually, you can use bait, but you can't use poison.
Use coyote remains? Can you use coyote remains to bait coyotes?
I don't know. I have to go back and look at the bait.
Don't worry about that.
The bait provisions.
Okay.
Should I move on?
Yes, please.
Then there are exceptions to both the retrieval and the use sections. So 4922, which is retrieval, and 4923 do not apply when the failure to retrieve, the failure to salvage, or the failure to retain the covered wild animal is beyond the control of the person due to the theft of the covered wild animal by another person, unavoidable loss in the field to a wild animal, lack of legal access to a property where a wounded or dead covered wild animal is located, including when signage on the property will lead a reasonable person to believe that hunting is prohibited on the land, or other circumstances that prevent salvage, retrieval, or retention. There's also an exception in order to defend a person or property, including defense of property authorized under Title 10, Part 4, or rules adopted under Title 10, Part 4. Exception is also there for when the covered wild animal is sick or diseased.
Sorry to interrupt. So the other circumstances that prevent salvage, retrieval, or retention, who would determine?
So originally that language was the act of God language, when presented by an act of God. And then there was persons that didn't like that phraseology, so this was added. The warden is the one that will be determining the enforcement entity. But that, you should understand where that language, it originally was the act of God, the weather event, flooding, something that would prevent someone from accessing the animal or properly using the animal.
And then in the immediately following in sub 2, in order to defend a person or property. So if you are, trapping or shooting or animals on a property in defense of that property, then you have no obligation to meet the wanton waste provisions.
To use or retrieve.
Use or retrieve.
Right, so, for example, there's the nuisance trapping provisions.
Right.
If you're out there and hired someone to nuisance trap in defense of your property, you don't have a requirement to use that animal.
But they would retrieve, supposing.
They will be retrieved. That's part of the nuisance trapping provisions, but they don't have to use them. There's exceptions in nuisance trapping provisions for nuisance trapping.
Okay, thank you.
It does not, use and retrieval does not apply to a state, federal, municipal law enforcement officer when they are acting within the course of their employment. And it does not apply when following generally accepted hunting or trapping practices for retrieval of a covered wild animal. When a practice is set forth under the statute or rules adopted under the statute or as approved as a best practice by the Commissioner of Fish and Wildlife. This last provision was one of the sticking points. The terminology when following generally accepted hunting or trapping practices, when you look at discussions and debate and academic articles about retrieval and use of animals, that term is there. It's used. It's kind of an understood term in the community that there are certain practices that do involve leaving behind parts of an animal.
You mean like field dressing?
Yes, and sometimes those provisions are actually codified in law, and so the interested parties wanted that to be recognized as an exception, that it's when it's a generally accepted hunting and trapping practice that it should be allowed and should not be subject to retrieval or use. There was concern that that was too vague. And so the discussion evolved that there are some of these practices that are set forth in statute or in rules. So those were referenced. But there are also other practices that may not be. But in order to provide some certainty about what they are, it was determined that the commissioner would would have authority to set that. And if you've ever looked at the hunting and trapping guide, it has guidance in it about how to comply with law. And it's not necessarily the statutory or regulatory requirements. It tells you maybe how to bag the remains of an animal, how to dispose of the remains. Those aren't necessarily in statute or rule, they're in the hunting and trapping guide. But the part one of the, at one point, the alternative was that the commissioner needed to publish them in the guide. And the commissioner was a little hesitant to do that because he wanted more flexibility to set practices instead of having to publish them in that guide. So this is where the committee came out on in their discussions with the commissioner.
So if it's has the status guidance, how does that provide the basis, the legal basis for enforcement?
Well, if it's approved as a best practice by the commissioner, and the commissioner likely is going to have to do that through an official act, publication of some kind, then it provides a legal defense to the requirement to retrieve or use.
So that will in the end require publication, because otherwise who's going to have the standard to refer to?
Right.
Okay, thank you.
And then there's a final substantive section on the disposal of covered wild animals or their parts. Person shall not place, leave, dump, or abandon the carcass or parts of a covered wild animal along or upon a public right of way or highway, upon a private property posted in accordance with the safety zone requirements or in accordance with the general posting requirements without permission of the owner or the owner's agent, or where prohibited by state or municipal law. Then the last section is the effective date. The act would take effect on passage.
Okay. So if your 5201 is posted land, right?
Yeah,
But it could be posted permission only, so you might well be there with permission.
that's correct.
Oh, but this is without the permission.
Mm-hmm. So
Just
you,
thinking if you're field dressing a deer,
right.
you have to drag it off that property.
If you are there without permission,
Yeah,
then you need to properly dispose of that on property other than the property that you are on.
okay. And the cross reference to 4710 is
Safety zone.
a safety zone. Thank you. All right, great. Any questions for Mr. Grady on H411?
I had a question for Mr. Grady before we're done this morning on the bill that we voted out on Friday.
Okay. Let's keep cranking on these, and we'll save that till get through. So I think our next bill in the stack is H175. Beverage container redemption system.
So again, I assume you all have a copy of the as-passed version.
Yes, sir.
The bill amends the 10 VSA Chapter 53, which is the chapter regarding the beverage container redemption system. It does several things. Generally, it expands the scope of the beverage container redemption system by changing the definition of beverage. It increases the handling fee to be paid for the non-commingled containers, and it then changes the provisions for the requirements for operation of a commingled program. It also removes the exception on the deposit for containers, liquor containers of less than 50 milliliters. And that's about it. So I'll now step through specifically. In section 1, in the amendment to 10 USA 1521, the definitions, the change to the definition of beverage is probably the major change in this bill because it expands the scope of the beverage container reduction system to wine, all carbonated and non-carbonated soft drinks, carbonated and non-carbonated water, and all other non-alcoholic carbonated and non-carbonated drinks, except for milk, dairy products, and plant-based beverages. Plant-based beverage is defined later in the bill effectively as those beverages that imitate milk and gain their major protein source from plants. The definition does clarify that beverage does not include non-alcoholic cider. So cider produced on a farm is not subject to the deposit requirement. I'm going to stop there and see if you have any questions.
Okay, are the containers for these beverages, non-alcoholic cider, any different than other containers that are already swept up by the bill? Is this a nature of the container exemption or a nature of who's producing it?
I believe it's more of the nature of who is producing rather than the type of container.
Okay. Thank you.
So moving down, you can see in the definition of container, currently there is an exception from the container requirements for those that are made of biodegradable material. One of the discussions on 175 was there are some of these expanded beverages that might be sold in containers that are not available for recycling. And a few years ago, you looked at whether or not to require recycling of orange juice containers, like half-gallon orange juice containers, and you learn that those containers are made not of cardboard, but of material, layered material that may include metal in the layering, and that they are not readily recyclable as of yet in Vermont, because you need special equipment to recycle that type of container.
These little small individual portions or gallons or half gallons?
So there is no size limitation in this bill as to how big the container is.
Do the manufacturers or the people that sell orange juice in these containers, do they sell them in big containers that you pour into glasses, or are they individual servings?
They do both. There's
Okay.
the half gallon that you buy pretty readily at the store that, you know, has a little screw cap on. That is made of the material, that's the layered material, but you can buy that same type of container, doesn't have a screw cap on it because it's a smaller size. Some of them actually do have a screw cap on, but it's a single serve.
So it's a complicated material. This is like a material science
Right.
issue.
And
Okay.
juice boxes are another example of this, of that type of material.
I remember once upon a time we looked at ketchup bottles, and I learned that there were 7 layers of different types of plastic in that what seemed like a bottle, a single bottle.
Should I
When are we
move?
gonna, not we, right, Vermont, but we just, when are we human beings gonna stop doing that?
That would be helpful.
So as part of this bill, A&R would have discretion to determine whether or not a container is not readily recyclable in the state and is not subject to the redemption system because there's nowhere to recycle it.
Would you remind us, what are the guidelines? Do we give them guidelines as to how they choose, or is it?
It's whether or not it's readily recyclable.
Okay, so that's it.
That's it.
Okay.
Which might be used as a list that supermarkets would say, hey, let's get the stuff that isn't recyclable and never use anything that is recyclable. Why
Yeah.
would we?
Well, you know, the market will manipulate, but I don't think it's going to be because of this state having recyclable requirement or not. It's going to be about the cost of the material and whether or not it is recyclable, because aluminum is probably the market that has the best recycling market, resale market. And if you're in a redemption program, you have to go collect all those containers and then you want to reuse them. So you're probably going to look at whether or not you can create an income stream.
You get more for
Right,
sending them to the,
right. To actually,
like I say, the black market, but the alternative market.
right. It's going to be a cost benefit analysis for each manufacturer and distributor.
So when are we human beings gonna start banning some of this big packaging that is destructive and blah, blah, blah.
We started an EPR bill this year, but there's like no capacity to really deliver on it. But that goes exactly to your point. If you make the producer responsible for the end of life disposition, they may make better choices, particularly if it's a financial incentive to do so. Okay.
So moving on, you'll see on page 3 of H175 that there is that definition of plant-based beverage. Liquid intended for human consumption that imitates dairy milk, consists of plant material suspended in water, and the primary protein source in the beverage is from plant material or derivative plant material. It includes rice, soy, nuts, oats, and hemp. One of the things that happened on the floor is what about coconut milk? What about, it's an including clause, right? Including means including but not limited to. So most of the plant-based milks or beverages will meet this requirement.
Isn't when we do including that, whatever, a canon of interpretation says that things that are like that are intended to be swept up by the law?
Yes, I mean, that's a judicial canon of construction. The General Assembly codified the provision that including means including but not limited to. It's in Title I. It reflects a Vermont Supreme Court decision that says you don't need to say but not limited to, because including means it's universal encompassing of those like materials. Should I move on?
Yes, please.
Mr. Chair, just why, it's not for the witness, but what's the rationale for exempting some these things as opposed to other things
So
in this that are opened and consumed and then thrown away or not thrown away?
the rationale for the exception of milk, dairy products, and the plant-based beverages is a rationale that gets incorporated into many bottle bill statutes across the country. It's about making products that are integral for the growth of children available to those customers that need to buy them at a less cost. And so milk and dairy products, I think you all know, it's generally known that they are very beneficial to the growth of children. Plant-based beverages, those children that cannot tolerate dairy and milk products often get their protein and their developmental nutrients from those plant-based products. So that was the policy decision that's reflected in other bottle bills across the country.
Is that
It
federal?
doesn't say you can't sell stuff.
You can
So you
sell.
can't sell it in certain types of containers. Or
No, you
can't
don't
be
have to
recycled.
collect the 5 cent redemption for it. So the customer doesn't have to pay that 5 cent additional cost at the time of purchase.
Turn it back in again, it's not an additional cost.
True, but it's a time of purchase cost.
Thank you. Thank you. I understand the rationale.
Well, I suppose then that kind of sensitivity built into the bill already helps, makes it easier to discuss changing the deposit. Because we're not asking, if it were a dime instead of a nickel, then it's 60 cents on a 6-pack of something, no substitute products. Anyway, thank you.
Okay. So moving on page 3 into 10 VSA 1522, the first thing that is done is that the scope or the exception, however you want to refer to it, as the deposit not applying to liquor containers of less than 50 milliliters, that is struck. So the small room service, airplane bottles, etc., they would have a 15-cent deposit on them. They currently do not have any deposit on them.
NIPS, I think sometimes they're called, right? Thank you.
Moving on from there, on page 4, you will see the increase in the handling fee for containers that are not part of the co-mingling program. And moving on from there, down on page 4 to 10 VSA 1524 and the labeling requirements. Currently, you probably don't even realize it, but the labels requirement of the deposit and the redemption value, that has to be currently on the top of the container. Right? You probably don't even realize that it's there, but it has to be on the top of the container. But some of the manufacturers are producing containers that are, it's not as easy to put all of that information on the top of the container. And what they've asked for is that for the metal beverage container, that the secretary allow other approved methods of securing to the container.
Okay, well, that's the labeling requirement. Was there a discussion around? I'll just hold the question for now. Thank you.
Okay. So then going on to page 5, earlier you were talking a little bit about this. This subdivision D allows the secretary to allow for wine bottles a conspicuous adhesive sticker to be attached to indicate the deposit information, provided that the size, placement, and adhesive qualities of the sticker are as approved by the secretary. And then the sticker shall be affixed by the manufacturer or the distributor. So it is not a state entity that is affixing the sticker. It's a manufacturer, the distributor. I would note that there has been testimony on this requirement in the past that likely the distributor, it's not likely, it's possible that the distributor will, as part of the condition of sale to the retailer, require the retailer to put the sticker on.
Part of a contract.
You'll probably see something like that.
So would that be considered part of a contract?
Yeah, it's a sales agreement, which is a contract. The distributor is going to pass the responsibility.
But right now, it's the distributor that would have to put the sticker.
Right now, it's the distributor or the manufacturer.
Wherever they might be in the United States, this is being manufactured in California, it's gonna come here.
Right, so
Okay.
this entire chapter applies to those manufacturers or distributors that sell or distribute the beverage into the state.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any fraud conversation that you're aware of around stickers?
I'm sorry.
Fraud conversations, did that come up?
Yes, I mean, it always generally comes up, especially for cross-border representatives, senators that are living close to the borders. There have been incidents of it. The Agency of Natural Resources does have authority to enforce. There are generally there can be some discretion for a redemption center to refuse, but those enforcement actions, the refusal, it normally occurs only with egregious incidents. The Senator McDonald was referencing the Seinfeld episode earlier. There was a town in New Hampshire that was bringing their redeemables across the border. And that it's noticeable, right? You have a mass volume, they determined the source and they prohibited that redemption, but the individual, it's harder to do.
Well, what does fraud actually look like? So I just want to be, so if you've got a sticker that says Vermont 5 cents, because I'm a border town also with New York, what exactly would an individual be doing?
So technically, that container sold in New Hampshire is not supposed to be labeled with the deposit information for Vermont or any other bottle redemption state. But that gets into what's called extraterritorial effect, because New Hampshire doesn't ban its containers from having that information on it. It's the bottle redemption states that ban those containers. But we can't enforce that requirement. This Vermont and other bottle redemption cannot enforce the labeling requirement in New Hampshire because it's outside the jurisdiction of the bottle redemption state. So manufacturers, to streamline their costs for labeling, and because they know that they're not going to be enforced against for selling that container with the label,
Yes.
and they sell it in New Hampshire, and that facilitates the ability of that New Hampshire customer to take that and to try to seek out redemption for it in a bottle redemption state.
I see.
And when the New Hampshire customer brings it back to Vermont, the bottler has to cough up the nickel, is that correct?
Yes.
So the bottler doesn't give a damn whether or not the thing comes back to Vermont because they're making so much money selling sugar and water that the nickel is meaningless in the situation that the witnesses just described, and they tolerate it.
I recommend you talk to the manufacturers and distributors about that issue. I don't think that they will admit that they're making so much money that nickel doesn't mean anything to them. But I do think it's probably a cost of the product as calculated for New England as opposed to calculated for Vermont, for New Hampshire, or Maine.
Who represents the redemption centers in the building? Do you know?
The redemption centers are, frankly, they're kind of independent. I don't know if they have an association, but they are not. They're active and vocal.
Yeah, sure.
They don't get that nickel. They don't get that nickel, they get the handling fee.
Right.
So whether or not there's something going on in monkey business in New Hampshire with cans going over there, coming back to Vermont, they get their handling fee also. The distributors have to cough up to them. And So there's no
But they're the ones that-
disadvantage to them.
They seem the ones most concerned about fraud.
You're getting paid to collect the bottles and return them for a fee.
So I suppose if bottlers were actually feeling fraud pressure in a significant way, they could just produce a Vermont only bottle cap, whatever.
Or basically not, I think you'd be reversed, that they would be selling in New Hampshire a container that does not have
Vermont on it.
the redemption
Yeah.
provisions on it.
If the Vermont recycling entity also sells stuff from their place, they're annoyed that New Hampshire gets to sell it for basically a nickel cheaper and without having to, they lose sales of the product, but they don't lose anything on the redemption end. They're made whole for any fraud that's going on, they get their nickel one way or the other.
Let's
Interesting.
Okay,
move on.
so
That's helpful.
the last section, actually, there's two more sections. In order to enter into a commingling agreement, there are requirements under A&R's rules that the agreement represent at least 30% of the beverage containers redeemed in the state of Vermont. And so this is basically an incentive for the distributors and manufacturers to work together. But the small manufacturers, the craft brewers, the brewers that are basically doing their delivery and handling themselves, they're never going to get to a 30%, right? So what the agency has proposed and what is in H-175 is to give A&R some authority to approve a commingling agreement that doesn't have that 30%, that doesn't reflect or represent 30% of the redeemed containers in the state, but it's just otherwise approved by the secretary. Maybe small craft brewers, small producers can find a way to act together in a commingling agreement, and it won't represent 30%, but it's still commingling. It still reduces costs, still reduces the number of sorts, reduces the number of persons, staff that a redemption center needs to have in order to do the sorting. So it's a further potential cost cutting for both the redemption center and the small manufacturer and distributor.
Okay. I think we talked about this a year or two ago where
Yes.
trying to encourage more commingling pools, even if they're not as big a pool.
And then there's some money that's necessary for A&R to revise the redemption system information. As you know, the sheets, the unclaimed beverage deposit, are deposited into the Clean Water Fund. What this section does, it says, notwithstanding the deposit of the sheets into the Clean Water Fund, Commissioner of Taxes shall deposit the first $18,000 of the abandoned beverage container deposits in fiscal year 2022. And then that 18,000 is going to be used for conducting information technology upgrades by A&R in order to implement expansion of the beverage container redemption system. Then you get to the effective date, and the effective date and the appropriation likely need to change, because it's not going to be in fiscal year 2022, it's going to be in fiscal year 2023. And you just likely will not be able to stand the bill up by July 1, 2022 if you enact it this year.
Do you have a suggested date based on any conversations you've had with parties?
I would just push it all out a year.
And do you know what that means, practically speaking, conducting information technology upgrades to implement the expansion of the beverage container system? Like what do they need to get done?
They need to register all these new beverages, and figure out what they are and establish the contacts for the registration of those beverages.
Is there a registration fee?
No, at the current point, there is not.
Right, Senator Kincaid.
I don't know if this has been asked by Senator Westmer or not. He is on the screen behind you. The difference between a redemption center and a store taking a bottle back.
There's actually a definition of redemption center. A redemption center means a store or other location where any person may, during normal business hours, redeem the amount of the deposit for any beverage container labeled or certified pursuant to section 1524. So it really doesn't have much distinction, except that a retailer that is also selling can seek the exemption from redemption, where a redemption center is just, they are just redeeming.
Thank you. Senator Westman, we're good. Thank you.
Yeah, Senator Whiteman, sorry, I've been looking up at the screen. But
No problem.
Yeah, he's had his hand up for about 45 minutes. But
Yeah. Yeah, if you use your little yellow hand, I might see it. We've never done that in this room, the yellow hand. Okay. Okay, if we could pause for a moment, Mr. Sapowitz is here to, Representative Sapowitz is here to talk to us about another bill, and that is H446, an act relating to miscellaneous natural resources and development subjects. Good morning, thanks for coming in.
Good morning, Larry Sapowitz, representative from Randolph.
Great. You know, my regular question to folks is, what opportunity did you see or problem do you see that the bill addresses?
Well, this is a technical corrections bill that was requested by the Agency of Natural Resources.
Okay.
And so it is has a long sort of laundry list of mostly very small changes to statute. And in fact, I was not really quite sure what the committee would like, to hear about this. I guess we could go a couple of different routes, more of a sort of an overview of the sort of more important or more involved sections of the bill, and or a more detailed section by section run through.
Okay, I think so. There's modified definitions up front. There is a policy on surface water withdrawals. Oh, sorry, it's surface waters. The other bill we have is groundwater, registration and reporting. And this is still all related to surface waters. There's interbasin transfers. You know how this section 1044 interbasin transfers of surface. So again, it's surface water. So is that the difference
I'm not sure. Are we,
between that and the others?
I'm wondering if we're talking about the same. I'm sorry. I wonder if we're talking about the same bill.
So we already did surface waters with Dolan, right?
What's the bill number we're talking about?
Yeah, I think I might have 446.
446 is the one I'm here for.
Sorry.
Yeah, she was 466.
So I'm sorry, I flipped into the wrong bill. Are there any, well, how about this? I see a lot of, as you were saying, sort of modest technical changes. Are there any that were controversial in any way that you want to draw our attention to?
There was nothing controversial. We did note that there were a couple of sections that will be the ones that would be most likely for folks to have questions about. And The one which is probably would have the most questions would be sections 4 and 5, which concern the environmental contingency fund and the waste management assistance fund.
Page what?
4 and 5.
Sections 4 and 5.
Page,
4 and 5.
thank you.
Section 4 increases the amount that ANR can spend from the environmental contingency fund when they respond to an emergency situation. Increases from $100,000 to $350,000. This will make it easier for the agency to respond in a timely manner to emergency events. And Section 5 gives ANR more flexibility to transfer funds from the Waste Management Assistance Fund to the Environmental Contingency Fund. It also increases funding for local solid waste management. This section ensures that before funds are transferred to the ECF, that the solid waste obligations of the fund are met.
Is this because the ECF has been sort of spending down over years, sort of basically kind of running out of money? Is the Waste Management Assistance Fund healthy, and that's why they're proposing a transfer?
I don't recall the healthiness of the respective funds, but perhaps Michael Brady knows.
It's relatively healthy. What the dynamic here is that the solid waste management entities are supposed to get a portion of the waste management assistance fund to pay for their costs, and anything that's moved out for any other use is lost funds to them. And so they want surety that if money is going to be transferred from waste management to ECF, that their needs are met first. And so that's what it was a negotiation between the SWMEs and ANR that continued.
Thank you.
And then the other sections where we thought people might have some questions or concerns would be sections 8 and 9 about brownfields and the liabilities around those. Section 8 would allow municipalities to be exempt from liability the same way as a regional planning commission is exempt. This would allow municipalities more opportunity to clean up brownfields within their jurisdiction. And section 9 clarifies that the purchaser of a property that has a brownfield will not be liable if they're determined to be eligible for the brownfields program and are working in good faith towards meeting the obligations of the program. This should reduce uncertainty on the part of prospective buyers of such properties.
So in the brownfield transfers, is this only because there is no liable party for the cleanup and something is basically sort of stuck? There's no one to do the remediation, and then the municipality can accept it without inheriting a liability for the sake of them pulling in grant money, for instance, to then undertake the remediation to revive it as an economically viable parcel.
Basically, yes. Right now, when municipalities only qualify for that immunity and participation in brownfields if they've acquired the property through forbearance or abandonment or tax delinquency, whereas the regional development corporations don't have that condition. So if a municipality wants to be creative and enter into a brownfield redevelopment, they basically have to go through a forbearance proceeding or tax delinquency instead of maybe negotiating with the property owner or being creative in the acquisition of the property. So this levels that playing field for that. And brownfields does provide a limited liability protection. It doesn't fully immunize you from federal liability under CERCLA, but it does provide you as much liability protection as ANR can provide, subject to a ton of conditions, of course. There's a lot of money being moved into brownfields right now to do redevelopment and to remediate these properties. So Baynard wants municipalities to be on a level playing field with the regional development corporation.
Are we in any sense making private costs for cleanup public costs?
You know, that's a pretty good policy discussion. I mean, I think there's probably possibilities where there is still a property owner that has some liability that is available. But the governmental entity wants to, but they probably can't afford to do all the remediation or all of the redevelopment. And that's when the governmental entity, so it's possible.
Yeah.
Possible. I don't think it, most of the time, as you noted, brownfields are when they're abandoned, but there isn't somebody there that can cover the liability, or the brownfield isn't reaching the Superfund level of brownfield. It's not reaching that, hey, there has to be that aggressive enforcement and remediation from the governmental entity. Brownfields can kind of be in that gray area between just an old unused property and a hazardous site.
Thank you. Anything, Representative Sackwitz, you want to note on section 9?
Yes, no, that was about purchasers of the property, that they would also are eligible, that they will not be liable if they're determined to be eligible for the brownfield program. And then there's sort of a host of various kinds of tweaks that the rest of the sections give. I could just sort of run through the general nature of them, if that would be helpful to the committee.
Sure. I think actually the one I'd most like to hear more about is the natural resources board, beginning on page 23, section 18.
Yeah, in section 23, those are changes to the calendar in terms of a lot of the Act 250 statute is in terms of, and I'm going to get it backwards, business days, and we're changing it to calendar days. Is that right?
Yeah, the whole judiciary system went to a day as a day.
Uh-huh.
And so to provide the same effective notice or opportunity, you have to kind of tweak the days again, the number.
And so that's just propagating it through their sections, all right?
Yeah.
Great. Anything else that you want to draw our attention to?
In particular, all the other sections are pretty much, bookkeeping type of affairs, and I'm not really sure how much else to say about them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much for coming in.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
How's the floor going?
It's busy.
Yeah,
It's stuck there, so.
yeah, it's taking its time.
Okay.
Did the mercury bill pass?
Yes. When I left, we were on the 100th.
Okay. So, Mr. O'Grady, thank you. If we could talk about 501 while we still have you with us, that would be great.
Sure.
Yeah.
So Chair, earlier you asked whether or not 501 is comparable to S282. It is very similar to S282. It is not exactly the same because the committee did do some revision. So what the 501 does in section 1, it creates a moratorium beginning March 1, 2022 on A&R issuing a new solid waste certification, which is what they call their permits for solid waste. They call them certification, or an amending a certification that would allow the operation of food depackaging equipment until rules are adopted by A&R as required by the bill to address and establish standards for food depackaging operations.
If this were to pass in law, it's probably gonna happen May, June. So do we need to pull that date forward?
You could pull that date forward. I think it probably won't have much effect because there are only a couple of food depackaging facilities operating in the state, and I don't believe A&R plans to issue any new ones between now and whenever you enact this. And I don't think the certifications will be amended. However, there is a provision in here that allows for the amendment of existing certifications for food depackaging if it is to reduce the contaminants in the byproduct and there is no increase in production from that food depackaging facility.
Does it make sense though to you as a lawyer to move that date forward?
I mean, it's definitely more intuitive. That I have less reservation about retroactive dates than other people do, because I think if you are clear about the retroactive nature of a date, the courts have said that that is within your prerogative.
Yep. So if they were to issue a certification next month, but this didn't pass till June, what would happen?
Well, it would have no effect on that certification because the law is applied when the person submits the administratively complete application.
All right, so, okay. Basically, that's the deadline that a lawyer who was looking at the process would use.
Right.
Got it, thanks.
So you could move the date for clarity. Then section 2, A&R is supposed to report back to the General Assembly with a report regarding the management of materials produced by foods and packaging. It shall be developed through a collaborative stakeholder process that includes the chair of the House Committee on Natural Resources or designee, or the chair of the Senate Committee on Natural Resources and Energy or a designee, a representative of the Agency of Ag, and a representative from composters, anaerobic digesters, food producers of food residuals, municipalities, haulers, packagers, and environmental organizations. I will have to say that this kind of working group, the stakeholder process, it probably could be fleshed out and directed, because I'm not sure who's supposed to actually run it.
Right, there's no chair, there's no meeting, there's no call, quorum, all that, okay.
So you've done language like this before, and for example, the Department of Forests and Parks likes language like this because they have a bunch of working groups already, and you just direct the Commissioner of Forests and Parks to like go have a stakeholder process, and he does it. But here there's a little, you don't have that kind of framework for this issue, and you're lacking some detail about who's running it,
Right,
how it's going to be run, etc.
right, it's like there's no first meeting called.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll move on.
Yes, please.
The report includes a list of the food and packaging facilities certified in the state, a summary of the chain of custody of the materials processed by food and packaging facilities, including the original supplier and transporters, the sites or facilities of final disposition of the materials process, including whether materials were disposed of in landfills, transferred to composting facilities, farms or farm fields, or introduced into foods for animal or human consumption. Summary of how the materials produced from food to packaging facilities or equipment may be used in the state, including any existing standards or statute or rule for the management of the materials. Page 3, the amount of microplastics, plastics, or other contamination present in the material produced from food to packaging, including whether the materials have detectable levels of perfluoroalkyl and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS. An MOU between A&R and the Agency of Ag on how they're going to coordinate and cooperate on adoption of the standards or rules for the materials produced from food packaging, because they both are involved in the use of food to packaging materials. And then an evaluation of the practicability of implementing the food residuals hierarchy in 10 VSA 6605K. You heard Representative McCall a little bit earlier talk about how there is this policy, how it should be implemented more, how maybe I think he said the hot dog buns should be removed from the plastic container. There's a whole discussion around the food hierarchy of whether it's mandatory or not. I believe it's a policy and not a mandatory requirement, because I think it would be impossible to enforce it as a mandatory requirement. But others disagree with that.
I think there was once upon a time, Hannaford used over plastic clamshells and poured the cookies into one thing and put the clamshells in another. And now they chuck the container with the cookies into it, and it goes on to a deep pack. That was, I think,
right. And there's also the discussion before it even gets to the food to packaging facility, it should be going to a farm for use for either food, farm food, which has an entire other issue of FDA compliance, or being used for composting. So that's part of that debate about whether or not the food residual, the food should even be getting to the food packaging facility.
Would this conversation about materials from food packaging may be used, does that naturally loop us into the biosolids discussion as well? Should they be referenced?
Biosolids are basically what this is all about.
Yeah.
Because for a large part of what it's about, because right now the material is going to digesters for its energy recovery, and then the product of that is then being spread on fields, farm or otherwise. And so that's why the Agency of Agriculture is involved. Also because they regulate compost and soil amendments, et cetera, and some of this material can be used in the production of those materials. So yeah, there is that is part of the discussion.
Okay. We just do the rulemaking, or?
Then there's a rulemaking about establishing standards for food material with the byproducts of food and packaging facilities, including what microplastics or other contamination will be allowed to be present. And then there's that provision that A&R shall not adopt the rules until they've submitted the report. The report will inform the rules, and A&R will not adopt rules that restrain agricultural activities without the consent of the Secretary of Agriculture, Food and Markets. That was a concern that the Agency of Agriculture had, that because of their involvement in this issue, the fact that farms are either being used for land application or producing compost or other materials from this material, that the Agency of Agriculture should be involved that language about constraining agricultural activities, it's language that's used in the wetlands rules, it's language that's used in the river corridor rules. It's not ubiquitous, but it is not the first time that the General Assembly has used that language. And then the moratorium gets repealed on the effective date of the rules for food to packaging facilities.
So the not initiating rulemaking until the reports come in. Is that basically a way to tap the brakes so that, well, to assure that the rulemaking doesn't proceed to the legislature step. Therefore, if we found something we didn't agree with, we have their ability to write law.
It's to inform the rulemaking and to give the General Assembly a second bite at the apple if when the report comes back, they see something that they want to legislate instead of regulate.
Thank you very much for coming in. Thank you for putting up with the start-stop thing as we have people jumping in and out on the floor. And we'll
Thank you.
continue on bill introduction, schedule the two that we can get to another time.
Okay.
Thank you, Michael.
Is the Senate token today or?
Yeah.
For the time being, Tuesday, Wednesday are tokens.
Okay.